There are men in the high country whose names you don't say after dark. You whisper them, if you say them at all, the way you talk about a wound you're afraid to look at. Silas Vane was one of those names. They said he'd hanged a posse from the same cottonwood, one after another, and made the last man tie his own knot. They said the snow on his ridge never melted because the cold of what he'd done had soaked into the ground. Mothers in the valley used him to frighten children into bed. So when a wagon came up the Coldwater Road in the spring of '84 carrying a widow in a borrowed black dress, a woman who had answered a letter and signed her own name to a marriage with that man, the whole valley held its breath and waited to hear how she'd die. I'm the one who watched her step down off that wagon. I'm the one who knew the part of the story nobody else did. And I'm going to tell you something now that took me a long time to understand. Sometimes the most feared man in the mountains is feared for the wrong reason entirely. Sometimes a monster's reputation is the only roof a frightened thing has left to hide under. And the woman who married him, the woman everyone pitied, she was the only one brave enough to walk inside and find out what the fear was really for. Stay with me. By the time she found the truth, I was praying she'd run. By the time it was over, I was praying she'd stay. I remember that more than anything else about the wedding, not the words, not the dress, not even her face, though God knows I'd come to know that face better than my own. I remember Reverend Pickett, who'd buried Hardman and birthed nothing but trouble in 40 years of this valley, dropping the good book in the dirt of Silas Vane's front yard because his fingers wouldn't hold still. He picked it up, brushed it off against his coat, and he would not look at the groom. Nobody would. There were maybe 9 of us standing in that yard, and 8 of us were finding reasons to study our boots, the sky, the long blue shoulder of the mountain behind the house, anything but the tall man in the black coat who stood waiting to be married. I was the 9th. I looked at him because I always looked at him. A man gets used to the thing other men are afraid of, when that thing has carried him 3 miles down a mountain with a busted leg and never once complained about the weight. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me set it down proper, the way I set everything down. I keep a tally book, have since the war. Little leather thing, soft as a glove now from 40 years of pocket, and I write in it with a pencil stub I have to wet on my tongue to make it mark. Most of what's in there is numbers, head of cattle, sacks of flour, days till the snow. But sometimes a thing happens that I can't make into a number, and I write that down too in my chicken scratch so I'll know later it was real. The day Cora Mercer married Silas Vane, I wrote 3 words. She doesn't know. She didn't. That was the whole rotten heart of it. She'd come up the mountain to marry a butcher, and she didn't know the first true thing about him, and neither did anyone else. And the only man alive who knew it all was a 61-year-old saddle tramp with a bad hip and a button on his coat that's been missing its brother since Antietam. I fidget with that button when I'm nervous. I was fidgeting with it that whole wedding. Worked it half off its thread. She came up on the Tuesday wagon. Old Hollies drove it, and Hollies drove that road every week of his life, but he wouldn't take her all the way. Stopped at the bottom of the Coldwater grade, set her 2 trunks down in the mud, pointed up the hill with his chin, and was gone before the dust settled. Wouldn't take her money for the last mile. Wouldn't take anything that might bind him to the place. So she walked it. A mile up a mountain in a black dress and town shoes, dragging what she owned in the world behind her. And when she came over the last rise into the yard, she was breathing hard and her face was red, and there was a smear of mud up one side of her skirt where she'd fallen. She was younger than I'd figured. The letter Vane had let me read it. The once had a steady hand and grown-up words, and I built a picture of some hard-faced spinster who'd run out of other roads. But the woman who came over that rise couldn't have been 30. Brown hair coming loose from its pins. A jaw she held set like she decided something and was daring the world to argue. And eyes that went round and white when she got her first proper look at the man she'd come to marry. He was standing in the doorway of the house. He's a big man, Vane, and the door frame makes him look bigger, and he doesn't smile, never has, not the way other men do, So the first thing you see is the size and the stillness and the scar that runs down through one eyebrow and skips his eye and picks back up on the cheek. I've watched grown men go quiet when they see that face for the first time. I watched Cora Mercer's hand come up to her own throat and stay there. But she didn't run. I want you to hold on to that because it's the thing I held on to. The whole valley had bet she'd run, and a few of them had bet she'd be dead inside the month, and there was money changing hands down at the trading post on both, and the woman just stood there, got her breath, wiped her muddy hand on her muddy skirt as if a little more dirt mattered, and said, in a voice that only shook a little, "Mr. Vane, I'm Cora. I expect you got my last letter since you didn't write back to tell me not to come." And Silas Vane, the most feared man in the Black Range, the butcher of Coldwater, the name you don't say after dark, he looked at this small, muddy woman who'd walked a mile to marry him, and something happened in his face that I'd only seen twice in 11 years. It moved, just barely, a crack in a stone wall there and gone. "I got it," he said. "There's water on the stove if you want to wash." That was the courtship. That was the whole of it. They married 3 days later because the Reverend could only be got to come the once, and he wanted it done in daylight, and he wanted plenty of us standing around so that whatever Vane was going to do, he'd have to do it in front of witnesses. Pickett told me that himself later in his cups. He thought he was marrying a lamb to a wolf, and he wanted God and the county to see it happen so somebody would hang for it after. Nobody hanged for it. That's the part folks never could swallow. I should tell you what they said he'd done. The reputation. Because that's the thing she married, not the man, not really. None of us marry the man. We marry the story we've been told about him. And the story of Silas Vane was the blackest story in that country. They said that 8 years before, a company of men had ridden up into the high country after a band of Apache that had jumped the reservation. Hungry people, mostly. Old men and women and a clutch of children, and maybe a dozen warriors with them who'd had enough of watching their families starve on flour full of weevils. The company that went after them wasn't soldiers. It was something the territory had hired and didn't want to look at too close. Men who got paid by the result. And the result they got paid for came with proof you cut off a body and carried in a sack. And they said that Silas Vane, who had a place up here even then, who knew these mountains better than any man living, had hired on to guide that company, took their money, led them up. And then the story went something turned in him. Some say he went mad. Some say he'd planned it from the start. But what came down out of those mountains a week later wasn't a company of bounty men. It was 4 survivors, half froze, raving, telling a story so ugly the territory paid them to stop telling it. They said Vane had turned on his own party in the night, picked them off 1 and 2 at a time in the high passes where the snow ate the sound of it. They said he'd hanged the captain and 3 others from one cottonwood down by the Coldwater Ford and left them for the ravens, and that he'd made the captain watch the others go first. And the Apache vanished, gone, 8 years and not a sign, and the valley decided that meant Vane had finished what the bounty men started, taken the territory's coin and the band's lives both, a double devil who'd killed everyone just to keep all the silver for himself. That was the man Cora Mercer married. A man who'd murdered white and red alike and walked back into his own kitchen and lived 8 years on a mountain everyone was too scared to come up. The territory never tried him. Couldn't. The only witnesses were 4 broken men whose stories didn't match, and a hanging tree by a ford, and a silence up in the snow that nobody would climb high enough to question. So they did the thing people do when the law can't help them. They made him a story. They made him the dark you tell your children about. And a story like that, it keeps a man as alone as a leper. Now, I'm going to tell you that almost none of that was true. But Cora didn't know which parts, and neither in the beginning did she ask. That was the first thing I came to admire about her, and I'm a man who came to admire a great deal. She didn't pry. A woman walks into a marriage with a man like that, you'd think she'd be all questions, testing the floor before each step. She wasn't. She set her 2 trunks in the small back room he gave her, separate from his, I noticed, and so did the valley, and they made an ugly joke of it. And she went to work like the place was hers and always had been. And the place needed work. Lord, it needed work. Vane kept it spare. A man living alone with a head full of whatever he carried, he'd let things go in the way a man does when he stopped expecting tomorrow to be much better than today. The garden was choked. The chickens ran feral. There was a milk cow named, far as I could tell nothing, who'd gone half wild for want of regular hands. Cora looked at all of it the morning after the wedding, standing in the yard in an apron she'd sewn from a flour sack, and I watched her roll up her sleeves with the particular grimness of a woman who has decided that the way to not think about a thing is to bury it under labor. She had a quirk too, now that I think on it. She talked to the animals. Not baby talk, she talked to them like neighbors she was a little annoyed with. "You and I are going to come to an understanding," she told the cow. "I have had a harder month than you, I'll wager, and I am not in the mood." The cow stood for milking inside a week. The chickens came to her hand inside 2. I have known that woman to win the trust of a wild thing faster than any soul I ever met, and I have thought, more than once, that it's the same gift that let her win the trust of the wildest thing on that mountain. But that came later. What I want to put down here, before I get to the night it all cracked open, is the smallness of how they were with each other. Because the valley imagined some horror, a brute and his prisoner, and the truth was so much quieter and stranger that I don't think any of them could have stood to know it. They were shy. That's the only word for it. 2 grown people who'd each given up on the thing other people get, suddenly sharing a roof, and neither of them knew where to put their hands. He'd come in from the high pasture at dusk and she'd have supper on, and they'd sit at the table and eat in a silence that wasn't cold, exactly, it was careful. Like 2 people carrying something fragile across a room. Once I saw her reach to take his plate and their hands touched on the rim of it, and they both pulled back like the tin was hot, and neither of them looked at the other, and I had to step out onto the porch so they wouldn't see an old man grinning like a fool. He started shaving regular. I noticed that too. A man who'd worn the same scrap of beard for years, and suddenly there's a strop hanging by the wash basin and his jaws smooth of a morning. He never said why. He'd have died before he said why. And she started humming, just under her breath, doing the wash, weeding the garden back to life. A little tune I didn't know. I caught Vane standing stock, still in the barn doorway one afternoon, listening to it come across the yard, and the look on his ruined face was the look of a man who's found water after he'd made his peace with dying of the thirst. I wrote in my book that week, I think they might make it. I am not a smart man, particularly. I had it exactly backward. I thought the danger was that they'd fail. The danger was that they were starting to succeed, because the closer they grew, the closer she came to the locked door at the back of the house, and the thing behind it, and the truth that Silas Vane had built his whole monstrous reputation to keep buried. The night it cracked, there was a storm. Spring storms in the high country come up the valley like an argument. You hear them a long way off, building, and then they're on top of you all at once. This one came after midnight. I was in the bunk room off the barn where I sleep, listening to the rain come at the roof in fists, and I'd have slept through the whole thing if it hadn't been for the lamp. A light crossing the yard. I came up on one elbow and looked out the little window, and there was Cora in her nightdress, a shawl over her shoulders gone dark and heavy with the rain, carrying a lamp with her hand cupped around the flame to keep it living. She was crossing from the house to the root cellar, that low-mounded door set into the hillside where Vane kept the winter stores, and I thought, fool that I am, that she'd run out of something. Lamp oil. Flour. Some woman's errand the storm had made urgent. Then I saw she wasn't going to the cellar. She'd stopped. The lamp showed her face, and her face was wrong, wide-eyed, listening, turned toward the back of the house where the addition was, the room Vane kept locked. The room he'd told her on her first day was full of old things, nothing for you, in a voice that closed the matter. And I understood with the storm roaring and my old heart going like a colt's that she'd heard something. Over the rain. From that room. I'd heard it too the once years back. It's why I knew. I should have stayed in my bunk. God help me, I should have let it lie. But I was up and pulling my boots on before I decided to, because I knew what was behind that door, and I knew what it would do to her to find it the wrong way, alone, at midnight, with the man she was learning to love asleep 20 feet off and 8 years of murder hanging on his name. By the time I got out into the rain, she was already at the back of the house. The lamp was a smear of gold through the downpour, and I saw her hand go to the locked door, and I saw the door give. It wasn't locked. That was the thing. He'd stopped locking it. Somewhere in those weeks of shaving and shy suppers and a tune across the yard, Sela's vein had stopped locking the one door that held his whole secret, and I don't know to this day if it was carelessness or if some buried part of him had decided it was time, finally, after 8 years, to be known. The door swung in, the lamp went forward with it. And from inside that room, over the rain, clear as a bell at the bottom of a well, came a child's voice. Small, frightened, speaking words that weren't English and weren't meant for any of us, the way a child cries out half asleep when the thunder's bad. I stopped in the middle of the yard, with the rain running down inside my collar. Cora Mercer stood frozen in the doorway with the lamp held up, looking at the thing the most feared man in the mountains had been hiding all these years. The thing he'd murdered to protect, the thing he'd made himself a monster to keep safe. And I was too far off to see her face. 40 years I've second-guessed less than I second-guessed those next 10 seconds, standing in the rain with a broken lamp's flame guttering blue on the wet boards of the doorway and Cora Mercer gone still as a fence post in front of a thing she was never meant to see. Every instinct I had said go to her, and something older than instinct said no. This is hers to walk into, and yours to stay out of, old man. You've kept this secret 8 years by knowing when to be a stone. So I was a stone. I stood in the yard and let the rain have me, and I watched. The lamp had broke but not gone fully out. There was a little burning oil pooled on the threshold, throwing up just enough light to paint the inside of that room in shakes and shadows. And what it painted, I'd seen before, though it had grown since. The room was warm. That was the first wrong thing if you were expecting horror. It was the warmest room in the house. There was a small iron stove in the corner, banked low and red, and the air coming out the open door smelled of wood smoke and dried herbs, and the particular milk-can-sleep smell of a place where children live. Children, 3 of them. The oldest was a girl of maybe 12, already up on her knees in the bedding with a wood-handled knife in her fist. She'd come awake the second the door gave and put herself between the light and the 2 littler ones behind her, and she held that knife like she knew the cost of it, like she'd been taught young and taught hard. The middle one was a boy, 7 or 8, blinking and frightened, the one whose cry had carried across the yard. And the small one was just a baby, really, 2 at the outside, curled in a nest of blankets and still half down in sleep, one fist working at nothing. Apache, all 3. And it landed on me the way it must have landed on Cora, the whole monstrous story of Sela's vein turning over in the air like a coin and coming down on its other face. He didn't kill them. The band that vanished 8 years ago into the snow, the band the valley swore he'd butchered for the bounty silver, he hadn't killed them. He'd hidden them. Or hidden these, anyway, these last few, these children in a locked room at the back of his house, for 8 years, behind the blackest reputation a man ever wore. He'd made himself the devil of the mountains so that no one would ever come up here to look. I had known there was a child. The once, years back, I'd heard a baby's cry on the wind, and Vane had caught me by the shirt and looked at me with a face I'll see on my deathbed and said, "You didn't hear that." And I hadn't. For 8 years I hadn't heard a thing. But I'd never known there were 3. He'd kept even me out past the door. He'd kept everyone out, the way a man keeps the world off a wound, and the cost of that keeping was that he'd had to be hated by every living soul in 100 miles. including, until that moment, the woman he'd married. The girl with the knife said something low and fierce in her own tongue. And Cora, soaked, shaking on her knees now in the broken glass without seeming to know she'd knelt, Cora put both her empty hands up where the girl could see them, palms out. The oldest gesture there is. I have nothing, I mean nothing. And she said in a voice I had to strain to catch over the rain, "It's all right. It's all right. I won't, nobody's going to." She didn't finish it. She couldn't finish it, because she didn't yet know what she was promising or who she was promising it to or what manner of man she'd married. And to her everlasting credit, she didn't pretend otherwise. She just held her hands up and let the children look at her and waited, in the wet and the cold, to be believed. That's when Vane came round the corner of the house. He'd woken to the broken light same as me, or maybe he never sleeps. I've wondered that. And he came out of the dark at a dead run with no shirt on and a pistol in his hand. And I have never, before or since, seen that man's face do what it did when he saw the open door. I've seen him face down 4 armed riders without his breath changing. I saw him, the time he carried me off the mountain, set my leg with his bare hands while I screamed and never once flinch. The fear that man knew that night wasn't fear for himself. It was the other kind, the worst kind. The kind that lives in the gut of anyone who's ever loved a thing they couldn't protect. He saw Cora kneeling in the doorway. He saw the children awake and the knife out. And the pistol came down, slow, his whole arm gone heavy with it, and he stood in the rain like a man waiting to be hung. "Sela's," Cora said. She'd turned, still on her knees. The rain was coming off the eave behind her in a silver rope. "Sela's, who are they?" And here's a thing I've turned over 1,000 times. He could have lied. He was the finest liar in the territory. He'd lied a whole valley into hatting him. Lied so well that men spat at his name and crossed themselves. Lied with 8 years of perfect, patient, terrible consistency. He could have spun her something. A story. A reason. He was good enough at it that she might even have believed him through till morning. He didn't lie. He stood there with the pistol hanging dead at his side and the rain plastering his gray-shot hair to his skull. And he said the truest thing I ever heard come out of him, and his voice broke on it like a boy's. "They're mine to keep," he said. "That's all, they're mine to keep." But she didn't run. I keep coming back to that in my book and out of it. Every reason in the world to run, and a clear road down the mountain. And a man in front of her she now knew had built his whole life on a lie black enough to fool God's own county. And she stayed. She got up off her knees, and she went past Vane, not away from him, past him, into the warm room, and she crouched down slow in front of the girl with the knife, and she did the thing that told me everything I ever needed to know about Cora Mercer. She started to clean up the broken glass, with her bare hands, picking the pieces out of the bedding one at a time so a child wouldn't cut a foot in the morning, talking the whole while in that low neighborly voice she used on the cow and the chickens, and I'd come to learn on anything frightened that needed to be reminded it was safe. "There now, there. Look at the mess I've made, and after your father got you all to sleep. He'll be cross with me. Won't he be cross?" And the girl watched her with those knife-bright eyes, and slow, the blade came down. I went and got a broom, seemed the least a stone could do. It was near dawn before the children slept again, and the 3 of us grown folks sat down at the kitchen table with the storm worn out to a steady gray drizzle, and Vane told her the truth. All of it. I'd had it in pieces over the years, a sentence here, a silence there. The things a man lets slip to the hired help he trusts, and then makes him swear off of, but that night was the first time I heard it laid out whole. And even knowing most of it, it took the wind from me. He had hired on to guide the bounty company. That part was true, and it was the part he hated most, and he didn't soften it. He'd needed the money, and he hadn't asked enough questions about what the money was for, and by the time he understood, by the time he saw what those men did with the proof they were paid to bring back, he was a week up into the high country with 11 killers and a band of starving people running ahead of them through the snow. "I told myself it wasn't my doing," he said. He had his hands flat on the table and he looked at them while he talked, the way a man looks at tools that have done a thing he can't take back. I told myself I just showed the way. A man can tell himself near anything for a while. What turned him, he said, was a morning by a frozen creek. The company had caught the tail of the band, the slow ones, the way it's always the slow ones, and what they did their Vane wouldn't say in front of me even years later, and I won't guess at it now. But when it was done, he found a child under the ice-bent willows where its mother had pushed it and died over it. The girl. The one with the knife, 8 years younger and frozen near to death and silent, because someone had taught her even at 4 that to make a sound was to die. And I stood there, Vane said, with my rifle and 11 men I'd led up that mountain for their money, and I made a decision a Christian man would call murder. He looked up then at Cora full in the face, giving her the whole weight of it to do with as she would. I was paid to find the savages, so I found them, one at a time, in the passes in the dark, the way they'd done to those people. I am not going to tell you I'm sorry for it, because that would be a lie, and you've had enough lies off me for one marriage. I'd do it again tonight. The hanging tree by the ford was real. The captain had been real, and what he'd ordered done by the creek was real, and Vane had given him the long view of the rope, and I will not stand here and tell you whether that makes my friend a monster or a man, because I have decided in my old age that some things aren't mine to weigh. The 4 that came down out of the mountains raving, they were the ones who'd run from him in the night and lived. They told a true story, and a true story so ugly the territory paid them to hush, and out of their fear and the valley's fear grew the legend of the Butcher of Coldwater. Vane never corrected it. Couldn't. The legend was a wall, and behind the wall were the survivors he'd gathered up, 3 of the band's children, all that was left, and an old woman who died of the lung fever 2 winters back and who'd made him swear to raise them. She's why they're still up here, he said. Old Nate. She wouldn't go to the reservation and watch them starve on weevil flour, and she wouldn't let me take them south where there's people of theirs, because south meant the road, and the road meant being seen, and being seen meant— He stopped. He didn't have to finish. Being seen meant a sack and a bounty. So I made them disappear. I made me into the reason nobody comes up the Coldwater grade. 8 years. He was quiet a moment. You walked up it anyway, he said to Cora, and there was something in it that wasn't quite a smile and wasn't quite a wound. You're the only one in 8 years had the gall. But now I have to set down the hard part, and it's hard because it's the part where I stop being able to tell you what was right. Cora hadn't said much through all of it. She'd listened with her chin set in that way she had, and her bandaged hands flat on the table near to his but not touching, and the only time her face moved was when he spoke of the girl under the willows. When he finished, she sat a long while. The drizzle had stopped. There was a bird starting up somewhere, the way they do fool things, like nothing in the world had ever gone wrong. I have to tell you something now, she said, and then you can decide what kind of woman you married. She hadn't come up the mountain on her own account. That was the thing. The letter, the marriage, the borrowed black dress, there'd been a man behind it down in the valley town. Her dead husband's brother, a hard piece of work named Royce Mercer, who held the note on the little farm she'd been left and had made it plain he'd forgive the debt for a price she wasn't willing to pay. Marrying Vane had been her road out, a desperate one, a fling yourself at the devil one, because the devil up the mountain frightened her less than the man down in town. She'd reckon, she said, that a monster who left her alone was a better bargain than a Christian who wouldn't. But here's the rest of it, she said, and now her voice did shake all the way through. Royce knows where I went. He knows I married you. And Royce has spent 2 years sweet-talking the territory men, the new ones, the kind who'd like nothing better than to finally settle the question of what happened up here 8 years back. I let him think— She pressed her bandaged hand flat to her mouth a second. I let him think I'd write him what I found. I never meant to. I only said it to get clear of him. But he's expecting a letter, Silas, and when it doesn't come, he's the kind of man who comes to see why. So there it was, laid out on the table between the 3 of us with the fool bird singing. Vane had kept the world off this mountain for 8 years with a wall of fear, and Cora, who'd come here running from her own trouble, had cracked that wall just by climbing it, and trailing behind her up the grade, slow but sure as weather, was the one thing the children couldn't survive. Eyes. Interest. A man down in the valley waiting on a letter who'd come looking when it didn't arrive. And Cora Mercer had a choice to make, and she made it at that table before the sun was full up, and it's the choice that made me love her like my own. She could have run, even then gone back down, written Royce his letter, given up the secret, and bought herself free and clear of the whole mess. Nobody could have blamed a woman in her spot. She'd been here 3 weeks. These weren't her children. This wasn't her war. The smart play, the safe play, was to be the eyes that the children couldn't survive and trade them for her own freedom, and never lose a night's sleep that any court in the land would say she'd earned wrong. Instead, she reached across the table and took Vane's hand, the first time I ever saw them touch on purpose, and she held it, bandage and all, and she said, "Then we'd best decide what we tell him when he comes, because I'm not going anywhere and neither are they." I marked that word. I marked it in my book that morning with my wet pencil, just the one word, big as I could make it. Because in that one word, a frightened woman who'd married a story took the man and his secret and his 3 hidden children and made them hers, not by blood, not by law, but by the plain decision to stand on the dangerous side of the door. She'd found the truth she came looking for, and having found it, she'd chosen to carry it. There's more to that morning, but most of it isn't mine to tell. The way Vane sat there with her small hand swallowed up in his and couldn't, for a while, find anything to say, and how the boy crept out from the back room and stood in the doorway watching the two of them, and how Cora saw him and didn't make a fuss, just moved the bread a little ways down the table toward an empty chair, an invitation with no words in it, and waited. He took the chair. After a while, he took the chair. But I'll tell you the last thing, because it's the thing that turned the whole business toward what came after, and you ought to have it before part 3. 3 days later, Holly's Tuesday wagon brought up the week's flour and salt, and a thing it had never once brought up the Coldwater grade in all the years I'd known it to climb. A letter, addressed to Mrs. Cora Vane in a cramped, mean, careful hand. She read it standing in the yard. I watched the color go out of her face the way water goes out of a tipped glass. I counted them through the field glasses from the high pasture where Vane had sent me to watch the road, and I counted twice, because the first time my hands weren't steady, and I wanted to be sure before I rode down to tell him a number that would decide things. 6 men. 1 wagon with a canvas top, the kind a man brings when he means to carry something back. And at the head of them, on a good blood bay he'd no business being able to afford, a narrow man in a town coat who could only be Royce Mercer, because he rode like a man who'd never once doubted he was owed. I'd worked the button half off my coat by the time I reached the yard. It came away in my fingers as I swung down the last brass button, the one whose brother I'd lost in a cornfield in Maryland when I was younger than Cora and stupider than I'd ever admit. And I stood there in Vane's yard with it loose in my palm like a small dead thing. And I knew, the way you know weather, that somebody was going to die before the moon was up. 6, I told Vane, and a wagon, and he's brought the law with him. There's a man in a good gray hat keeps his coat back off a badge. Vane took it without a flicker. He was good at that, taking things without a flicker. It was the skill of a lifetime. Territory marshal, he said. Royce found his money and bought himself a warrant, I expect. 8 years he's waited the territory. Somebody finally gave them a reason to climb the hill. He looked at me, and there was something almost gentle in it which frightened me worse than the 6 riders. "You ought to go, Gus, up to the line shack. This isn't your fight and you've got no name in it. There's no call for you to hang alongside me." "I've been chewing your beans 11 years, I said. "I expect I'll chew them a while longer." He didn't argue. He knew me. He just nodded once and turned to go find Cora, and I want to set down here that I was never prouder of anything I ever said in my life, and never closer to wetting myself with fear, than I was in that 1 minute in the yard. Here is what I had figured would happen, and you may have figured it too because it's how these stories go. Vane would send Cora and the children up the back of the mountain to hide, and he'd stand alone in the yard, and there'd be shooting, and the butcher of Coldwater would take as many down with him as he could before the end. That's the shape the thing wanted to take. I could feel it wanting to. Cora wouldn't let it. No, she said. We were in the kitchen, the three of us, with the riders maybe 20 minutes off, and Vane had laid it out, the back trail, the line shack. Take the children and go, and don't look back whatever you hear. And Cora stood at the table with her hands flat on it, the bandages off now, the cuts gone to thin pink lines, and she said no in the same plain voice she'd used to tell a wild cow they'd come to an understanding. You hide them and shoot it out, and you die, and then what? She said. Then there's 6 dead men and a dead monster and a marshal's report, and the territory sends 20 more, and they find the children inside a month because the secret died with you. Hiding only ever worked because nobody had a reason to look. They've got a reason now. They've got me. She said that last hard, taking the blame onto herself, and Vane started to speak, and she ran him right over. Killing them won't unring it, Silas. We have to make them not want to look anymore. That's a different thing than killing. And how, said Vane, very quiet, do you propose we do that? And Cora told us. It was a mad plan. It hung by a thread. It asked her to do the single hardest thing I ever watched a person do, and it asked Vane to stand still and let her do it, which for him was harder yet. But I listened to it laid out in that kitchen, with the light going amber in the window, and I understood that this woman who'd come up the mountain running from a coward had thought her way clean around the back of the problem, while the rest of us were still reaching for guns. She didn't mean to fight Royce. She meant to settle him, the way she'd settled the cow, the chickens, the boy who wouldn't come to the table. She meant to give the frightened, greedy thing in front of her exactly enough of what it wanted that it would turn around and go home. The trick was that what Royce wanted wasn't the children at all. Royce had never cared a pin for the children, nor for the truth about Coldwater. Royce wanted her back under his thumb, back owing him, the way it had been before she'd had the gall to climb out of his reach by marrying a devil. The marshal wanted the old Coldwater question closed. 2 different hungers riding up the same road, and Cora had seen that you could feed them separately. But they came into the yard, with the light near gone. Royce got down off the blood bay slow, making a show of it, the way a small man does when he's brought enough guns to feel tall. The marshal stayed mounted, a heavy older man with a tired face, the gray hat, a badge he kept covered like he wasn't sure yet he wanted it seen. The other 4 spread out easy along the fence. They'd done this before, those 4. You could tell. Cora, Royce said. He smiled. I have known rattlesnakes with more give in them. You look well, mountain air. I confess I expected to find you worse off or not at all. He let his eyes go around the yard, the choked no longer garden, the mended fence, the chickens settling to roost. You've been busy, playing house with the hangman. Hello, Royce, she said. She came down off the porch steps and stood in the open yard, alone, with Vane back in the dark of the doorway where the marshal could see the size of him, and not much else. I was at the corner of the barn with Vane's old buffalo gun across my arm and my heart going like a drum, and the loose button was in my shirt pocket where I'd put it. I don't know why, like a man carries a thing to have something to hold at the end. You never wrote, Royce said. We had an understanding. You'd write me what you found up here. His voice dropped into the wheedling register I'd later learn was the worst of him. The marshal's a patient man, Cora, but he's come a long way on the strength of a promise you made me. Now, you going to tell us what's behind that locked door, or am I going to have to be unkind about it in front of company? And Cora Mercer, Cora Vane, did the thing I'll carry to my grave. She laughed. Not a big laugh. A small, tired, contemptuous little laugh, the laugh of a woman who's just heard a child claim he could lift the barn. Oh, Royce, she said, you came all this way on that, on a scared woman's promise made to get out your door. She shook her head, slow, sorrowful, like she pitied him. There's no band of murdered Apache up here. There's no buried bounty silver. There never was. You want to know what's behind that locked door? It's a sick old hermit's dead wife's things he can't bear to look at, and a lot of cobwebs, and the reason a man who buried somebody he loved doesn't take kindly to strangers prying into his grief. She turned to the marshal then, and her voice changed entirely, went grave and plain and citizen to citizen. "I'm sorry, sir. You've been brought up a mountain on a lie, but it's not my lie, it's his." And she pointed at Royce. He wanted his brother's farm and his brother's widow both, and when I wouldn't have him, he cooked up a story about my husband to bring the law down on a man who'd embarrassed him by marrying me first. That's the whole of it. 8 years of valley gossip and a jealous man's spite. You're welcome to search the house if you don't believe me, but I'd think on whose word brought you here before you waste the daylight. The marshal looked at Royce. It was the smallest thing, that look. Just a heavy old lawman turning his head a few inches on a tired neck. But I have lived long enough to know that whole lives turn on smaller. Because the marshal had ridden a day and a half on the say-so of a man he didn't like, to settle a question the territory had wanted buried for 8 years, and a tired lawman would dearly love a reason to turn around and go home, and let the dark old thing stay dark. And here was a respectable woman handing him that reason, gift-trapped, and pointing the blame at exactly the kind of grasping, debt-holding, brother's widow-wanting man that every lawman in the world has met 100 times and despised every one. "That true, Mercer," the marshal said. "You hold paper on this woman's farm. That's got nothing to do with. It's a yes or no question, son." And Royce, who was narrow and proud and not near as clever as he thought, made the mistake of getting loud. He got loud about the debt and the disrespect and the years of waiting, and the more he talked the more he told that marshal exactly what Cora had just promised he'd hear, and I watched the gray hat tilt back and the tired face close like a door. By the time Royce thought to stop talking, he'd hung himself with his own rope every bit as sure as the captain on the cottonwood, and never even saw the tree. But it should have ended there. By rights it should have ended there, with the marshal disgusted, and the daylight gone and 6 men turning their horses around to ride back down a mountain they never should have climbed. It didn't quite, because Royce, beaten, did the thing a small man does when he feels the floor go out from under him. He reached for the only power he had left. He had a little pistol in his coat, a town gun, a coward's gun, and he didn't draw it on Vane and he didn't draw it on the marshal. He drew it on Cora. I don't think he meant to use it, even then. I think it was the gesture of a man who'd never in his life been told no and made it stick, grabbing at the last thing that might make the word come out yes. I've thought about it a great deal. I don't think Royce Mercer had a single clear thought in his head in that last half-second, except that the woman who just unmade him was standing 6 feet away, and he had something in his hand that could put the fear back in her face. He never got the chance to find out if he'd pull it. I have told you I am a stone. I have told you I know when to stand out of a thing. But there are limits to a stone, and the limit of this one was the sight of that little gun coming up level with Cora's breastbone, and I will not pretend to you that I made a decision, because I don't believe I did. The buffalo gun was already up. It had been up the whole while. And the yard came apart in noise and smoke, and when it cleared, Royce Mercer was down in the dust by the blood bay's feet, and he was not going to get up, and the little town pistol lay a yard from his open hand with not one shot fired out of it. I had killed a man in Vane's yard. After 11 years of telling myself the war had been the end of all that. I stood there with the gun kicking my shoulder still and a ringing in my ears and a great cold nothing where I'd expected to feel something, and the first clear thing I knew was Cora's hands on my arm, easing the gun down, and her voice, that low neighborly voice she used on frightened things, saying, "Gus, Gus, it's done. You can put it down now. It's done." The marshal looked at Royce in the dust a long moment. Then he looked at me, an old man shaking by a barn. Then he looked at Cora, and at the big silent shape of Vane still back in the dark of the doorway, who had not moved, not once, through any of it, who had let his wife fight the whole battle with words because she'd asked him to, and trusted her, and stood his ground in the dark while everything he loved hung on her tongue. "Man pulls a gun on a woman in her own yard," the marshal said slowly, to no one in particular, and gets shot for it by a hand defending the place. I've seen that before, I'll write it that way. He gathered his reins. He was quiet a moment more, and then he said the thing that told me he was a great deal less fooled than he'd let on, and had decided to be fooled anyway, the way a tired good man sometimes will. There's nothing up here, he said, worth the territory's trouble, nothing up here at all. I'll see it stays that way. He touched the gray hat to Cora, only to Cora, and he turned his horse, and he took his 4 men and the empty wagon and what was left of Royce Mercer down the Coldwater grade in the dark, and the territory of which I will not name never sent another soul up that road in all the years I had left to watch it. But I don't sleep so good anymore. That's the cost, and I pay it, and I've stopped expecting it to come down in price. Some nights I'm back in the yard with the gun kicking, but more nights, and this is the strange thing, the thing I can't account for, more nights I'm not in the yard at all. I'm at the kitchen table the morning after, with the light coming gray and ordinary through the window, and the children are eating, all 3 of them. The girl with the knife-bright eyes that have started, only started, to go soft at the edges, and the boy stacking his bread, and the baby in Cora's lap with one fist working at nothing. And Vane is across the table watching the 4 of them with that ruined face of his doing the thing it learned to do that spring, moving, cracking, a stone wall with water finally getting through. He'd built himself into the most feared man in the mountains so that no one would ever climb the hill and find the small living things he'd hidden behind his name. And a frightened woman in a borrowed black dress had climbed it anyway, found the truth, and instead of carrying it back down to trade for her own safety, she'd planted herself in the middle of it and dared the world to come and try her. The valley still tells the story of Silas Vane the butcher. They tell it to their children at night. I have never once corrected a soul, and neither has Cora, and neither did the marshal, and that is how the children up the Coldwater grade have lived to grow tall, protected, to this very day, by the blackest lie ever told in that country. A lie 3 frightened souls and 1 tired lawman agreed without ever saying so to keep on telling forever. I took the loose brass button out of my shirt the next morning. I'd carried it through the whole of it, and I meant to sew it back on the way I'd been meaning to for 30 years, and instead I did a foolish thing. I gave it to the boy. He'd taken a shine to it. He holds it sometimes the way I used to, turns it over, and I don't think he knows it's the last of a pair, or that its brother's been lying in a Maryland cornfield since before his grandmother was born. I never told him. Some things you just hand on, and let be what they'll be.